Hi, folks. The question arises, how many versions of a game can you get from one concept? Or perhaps we should say from one topic, because concepts can include how the game works, which takes them away from the topic itself. Well, I'm going to use the example of my own games, starting with Britannia. Britannia is a game about 1,000 years of British history. It's a highly strategic game. It's a quite long game, 4 to 5 hours. It's a very deep game. It's a game that some people have played 500 times despite that 4 to 5 hours. And it has been reissued several times, and latest just this year, 2020, by PSC Games in United Kingdom with plastic figures instead of cardboard. But the game is still the same as the Fantasy Flight Games version. Well, what else can we get from that? Many years ago, I designed a huge version of the same thing. I called it Megabrit. It had 55 areas instead of the 37. This is land areas in Britannia. It had 24 nations instead of 17 nations. And I believe it had a lot more than the 16 turns. It may have had 24 turns. And I actually played this a few times, but it was even then not really practical for commercial distribution because it was just too big and too long. Now, in the era of electronic games, it may someday see light as an electronic game because you can play an electronic game a while and then put it aside and play it again and so on. And so the length is not such a problem. In fact, some people prefer a long one. I also at one time made an expansion that was never published for Britannia that included Ireland and made everything a little bit bigger, but not a lot. But the difference was it included Ireland, whereas Britannia does not. Then around 2008, I designed a broad market version of Britannia, which I call Conquer Britannia. And that has like 18 areas. It has 6 turns, still has 4 players, but a lot fewer units. And it has been played in as little as 84 minutes. So I've cut the idea way down. I have another one, which I call Rule Britannia, which is kind of in between, but the big difference there is that it's diceless. It uses battle cards rather than dice. And of course, that makes a big difference from a lot of points of view. Now, recently, I've gone even further. I have no idea why. And made what I call a Minimalist Britannia. I wanted to make it as small as I could get it and still have a game there. And the first thing I had to do was reduce it to 3 players. It's 6 turns. They're all of 13 land areas. And partly to compensate for so few land areas, it is possible in certain occurrences where there's a draw in a fight that 2 different nations will occupy the same area. Now, a 3-player game is always a problem because if 2 players are not doing so well, or even if just one player is not doing so well and he thinks he's going to lose or she thinks she's going to lose, that player can gang up on one of the other 2 players and hence determine who wins. But if the situation is fairly static, it's possible to have a 3-player game that works out fairly well. And that's what I've tried to do in Minimalist Britannia. Now, could we go further? I guess you could go even bigger. I don't know that you can go any smaller and still have much of a game. But that's just with one game system. And the main difference between one and another is using dice or using cards. In none of those games have I used event cards, for example. None of those games have I used blocks or other hidden identity methods. So fundamentally, the game is pretty much the same despite all those different scales. What's changed is the scale. Now, not all topics are going to let you do this, but we know of many topics of battles where there are many different games about the same battle. So obviously, this can be done. Thanks for listening.